First of all, I'd like to thank Nordlandet, Norwegian Center for Human Rights, and Norwegian Venezuelan Justice Alliance for the invitation, and just to state that it's an honor to speak here today, particularly following up on the film and presentation by Antulio Rosales and so thank you. The title of my talk, of about 10 minutes I hope, is Transition to Justice and Democracy in Latin America, Lessons for Venezuela. It will be brief and superficial, I'm afraid, but hopefully we can use the hour for debate to clarify any remaining issues. The background is related to now dead and buried negotiations that have taken place in Santo Domingo between the opposition and regime, and also the likelihood that a negotiated outcome could produce a new democratic situation which would open for free and fair participation and competition between the political parties in the country, and open for a rule of law and justice, understood as the respect for human rights protected by a justice system in Venezuela. So when it comes to justice, the question on how to deal with human rights abuses under the previous regime or under an authoritarian regime always rises in the region and elsewhere, and so also in Venezuela. So to be brief, I hope to underline 2 points. Although I am normatively in favor of a negotiated solution in Venezuela, I see few chances that this will arise unless there is a division or schism within the current regime. And secondly, I will highlight that when compared to transitions to democracy in Latin America and negotiated solutions in internal civil-military conflicts, such as civil war in Central America, the Venezuelan case is special and very different from previous experiences. And these differences, I would argue, make a negotiated settlement, a transition to democracy and rule of law, arguably more difficult in Venezuela than in other countries. I'll try to use some comparative experiences to argue for this. Now, I think the comparative exercise is important because many of the opinions we read and analysis we read in the newspapers about the situation and the potential for a negotiated solution in Venezuela are indirectly or implicitly based on the comparison I'll now make and lessons from other countries. And I think many of them are too eager to point to likeness and similarities rather than differences with other cases in Latin America, which I think make the analysis maybe too optimistic or wrong. So first I'll do some brief theory or assumption I'll make, building on what we in political science would call the transition paradigm. And before I come to some comparative examples and end up with what I'll say is a skeptic's prognosis for Venezuela. Now, in general, to create regime change, rulers must see that the costs of ruling are higher than the cost of leaving power. Now, this concept can be manipulated in several ways. In Latin America, during or right after transitions to democracy, amnesty laws were passed in order to protect outgoing military rulers or the fighting parties in civil wars. Now, in some cases, this means that also truth commissions are sacrificed and the healing of wounds for the population may be postponed. Now, amnesty laws, which in most cases go against our sense of justice and rule of law, have later been repealed in various countries and declared against human rights by the Inter-American Court of Human Rights. Amnesty laws, however, reduces the cost for power holders to leave power, as they are certain they will not see the inside of a cell, but return to a civilian life and can, if they have been smart, live off whatever they were able to earn legally or illegally when in power. Now, another way to reduce the costs is to secure the former regime holders a steady income. This was most flagrantly done in Chile, where the military's control over the income from the copper mines was maintained into the democratic period. In other countries, the military was able to keep budget autonomy, or budget were not touched by new civilian rulers, afraid that this would cause the return to military rule again. Again, this reduces the cost for the military to leave power. A third way is for the military to keep its institutional autonomy, meaning keeping the military outside democratic control, something we also saw in Chile, but also Honduras and other countries. Now, fourth, new civil leaders could promise to keep the ideological economic model that the military supported, so that there are less ideological costs to leave power. Again, Chile is a good example of this. And fifth, democracy itself may be sacrificed by securing a position for the outgoing regime or warring parties, giving them representation in democratic institutions. We've seen that in Colombia recently, in the peace negotiation with FARC. Sharing power agreements in Colombia in '58 has the same resemblance. In Venezuela, the same year, partially the same thing. And we've seen the same thing in Brazil, where the military controlled the transition, and also in Chile, where the electoral system was manipulated to overrepresent the parties closer to the military rulers. So in the short run, to facilitate transition to democracy, justice, rule of law, and even democracy may have to be sacrificed in order to convince undemocratic rulers to leave power. Now, the degree to which outgoing rulers are protected by a negotiated settlement depends on the relative strength of the outgoing regime vis-à-vis the opposition. In Chile and Brazil, the military held a strong position and controlled the transition according to the rules they themselves had written, and the military came out well and alive, and democracy and rule of law suffered, at least for several years to come. In countries where the rulers were weak, such as the outgoing military regime in Argentina following the Falklands or Islas Malvinas War, we found a clear break with the past. We saw truth commissions, we saw many court cases, at least in the short run, and the break was facilitated by a previous palace coup within the military, so that the new rulers that initiated negotiations were less exposed to ending in jail than the previous rulers that they had replaced. Now, oppositions are often forced, but also often willing to agree to such terms, because the outcome of democracy and the exit of a military regime or authoritarian regime are worth the sacrifices of justice or limits on democracy. In Argentina, the expression nunca más indicates this willingness to sacrifice. Some democratic leaders, such as in Uruguay, for instance, also campaign on a message of leaving the past to the books of history and to look forward, seeing no court cases or justice as even preferable. So what does this mean for Venezuela and the potential of a negotiated solution? First of all, I think it must be clear that the current regime holders are not ready for full democracy. The rulers were given the opportunity for this after the December 2015 election, and also given the opportunity to accept a referendum of Maduro. They did not accept alternation in power and converted into a non-democracy. The opposition demanded in Santo Domingo the plain restoration of democracy, free and fair election, liberation of political prisoners, etc. Well, this didn't work 3 years ago and was unlikely to work in 2018 as well. Thus, in order to restore part of democracy, the opposition must give up on something, and justice for human rights abuses during the Chavez-Maduro era is probably the best bet for the opposition, yet the other strategies of power sharing, fixing institutions in favor of Chavismo, paying the regime off, maintaining the ideological model, etc., these could all be considered, but I think they are, some of them, not as effective in the Venezuelan case. And I will argue briefly for this. One, Venezuela is different than the other cases because the Chavismo started out as a democracy, and it has recently turned authoritarian. In almost all other countries, it was the other way around. More in particular, the repression has increased as of late, whereas in the military regimes in the south, the repression was hard right away and decreasing over time, which may or may not have helped the negotiation climate in other cases. It will certainly not help in the Venezuelan case. Now, Venezuela is going through, as we know, a harsh deterioration of the socioeconomic situation over the last 4 to 5 years. I would argue this makes a transition more difficult. It is now much more costly for regime holders to leave power, as they, should they stay out of jail, will experience a significant drop in income if they exit. The military and civilian leaders cannot expect to return to a middle-class income, holding a position within the state, going back to teaching in the university, or just claiming a military pension. The Venezuelan socioeconomic and humanitarian crisis has thus increased tremendously the cost for the regime of leaving power, as the loss of spoils will mean a huge and a larger drop in income today than it would have a couple of years ago, and also a larger drop in income than in many other comparable cases. A third factor is that whereas the military in, for instance, Chile, Uruguay, and Argentina, although they were failures in many respects, they could argue that they had saved the nation from the red threat when they left power. They did this by exiling, incarcerating, and killing many of the left. But the Venezuelan regime must yield power to its enemies and leaders that they see as a threat to the Venezuelan nation. And furthermore, the regime cannot, under any circumstances, argue for the maintenance of the current ideological economic model, and would have to see it replaced by a nominally more capitalist model that seeks support with the IMF or the World Bank, which are not in good view of the current regime. Although this only is a moral loss, this could also be a huge loss for the regime holders. A fourth, and I think the last point, I have several more, it's harder to buy off the current regime in Venezuela than it has been to buy off other regime holders. The military has expanded tremendously its legal or paralegal economic activities throughout the Chavez, in particular the Maduro years, and so the opposition could say you can keep these businesses, you can keep this steady income, but there is a huge problem. The regime also gains a lot of money on the current system that has created havoc in the Venezuelan society, such as the economic regulations, the import control, the exchange controls, and even worse, illegal activities such as drug business. Thus, letting the military keep its new legal businesses is not likely not to be enough, because it would be hard to consider a transition to democracy without touching the regulations and the economic model of which many current power holders gain so much money. So the economic incentives for the regime and the opposition or the Venezuelan society are reversed, even zero-sum. So it's my gain, that is your loss. So the logic here is sadly perverse, and it's also very difficult, of course, for an opposition to negotiate an acceptance of a military-led drug cartel, if that were the case. I have several more points here, but we'll take this up in the debate session, I guess. I'll just point out some of the lessons for Venezuela. First, I would say there was a huge missed opportunity to save democracy after the opposition victory in 2015 and the blocking of the referendum on Maduro. Secondly, the current condition, the current socioeconomic conditions, the nature of the regime as predatory, and the increasing negative trend of repression that is going on, make a negotiated solution extremely difficult, and it weakens the strategies that the opposition could hold in its hand that we've seen as successful in other countries. Third, something has to give, and justice is sadly the first to go. A free democracy is probably the second. This means amnesties and maybe restricted democracy with power-sharing mechanisms. And fourth and final point, I have long been saying that as long as the military supports the current regime and the current situation, a transition is unlikely. I still believe this, and taking cue from the Argentinian case, I think that an internal power shift, be that by the way of a palace coup or the likes, seems necessary, or at least positive, in terms of creating conditions for a negotiated solution, since this would reduce the cost for new power holders within the Chavismo to leave power. And I'll stop there.
We're moving to Antulio Rosales, who is a postdoc at the Center for Development and the Environment. He holds a PhD from the Basile School of Global Governance in Waterloo in Canada. He's currently working on issues related to resource extraction and in Venezuela, and he will speak on the topic of the relationship between economic and political, other human rights in Venezuela, which was an issue that was particularly debated a lot quite a few years back, when the Chavismo first gained power. So we're very excited to hear what you have to say about the relationship between these two aspects of human rights in Venezuela today.
Sure.
Please.
Thank you. Thank you so much, the organizers, for inviting me for this talk. So I won't use the PowerPoint, and I will try to skim through the statistics that would have been there and the pictures, but you'll get a mental image of what I'm saying as I talk. So yeah, I'm here to speak about the relationship between economic and socioeconomic rights and political rights in Venezuela. So as we've been hearing, the Venezuelan government has been accused of perpetrating sorts of violations of civil and political rights for a long time. But the governments of Hugo Chavez first and later of Nicolás Maduro disregarded these accusations by loudly promoting their movement as the champions of the people, and particularly of the poorest. The government dismissed these allegations by basically exalting the social policies that the Bolivarian Revolution has carried out in the country through the distribution of oil rents, and particularly through setting up a very audacious sort of network of policies that the government called las misiones sociales, or the social missions. And what I'm going to focus on in this talk is that as the economic crisis in Venezuela unfolded in the past 5 years, these policies have deteriorated dramatically, or they have been eliminated altogether. So the government's social policies not only don't satisfy the people's needs, but moreover, the few existing ones, and particularly the food distribution policies, are used as mechanisms of social control and political coercion. So that's my main point in this talk here. So I will not be talking about the causes of the crisis, because I already spent quite a few times before speaking about that, but we can talk about it later in our discussion. So the socioeconomic conditions of the population have worsened dramatically, and the apparent achievements of the past have actually been lost. If we follow the most trustworthy nationwide survey conducted in Venezuela, and it's done by a consortium of universities, the reason I'm talking about this survey and not the national statistics is because the national statistics are not publicly available since 2013 and 2015. So if we follow this survey, in 2017, 90% of the people consulted reported not having enough money to purchase food. And the vast majority of Venezuelans, we're talking about around 70% of the population, eat less than 3 times a day. And now,
Very pleased that Alfredo Romero is not only an excellent human rights lawyer, but also a technician. Thank you very much.
So this is very resourceful. So, as I said, the vast majority of the population eat less than 3 times a day, and the 70% of the population that eat less than 3 times a day have reported losing an average of 11 kilos in weight in the past years. So income-related poverty, or the poverty line, rose to 87% of the total population, and that includes 60% of extreme poverty. So over a third of households reported not being able to purchase any source of protein, while over 40% of households rely on tubers or different roots like cassava for the basis of their dietary needs. So there are many piling cases of people consuming poisonous cassava, for example, which is much cheaper in the markets, and dying out of food poisoning in Venezuela. This is common nowadays. I have to send to my relatives pictures of how different they look, so that they don't, by mistake, eat one of those. So what happened with the vast social policies that the Venezuelan government carried out in the past? Well, in 2015, around 2.6 million people reported having been beneficiaries of the most famous healthcare provision program offered by the government. That's the Misión Barrio Adentro, where communities all around the country offered primary care. And In contrast, in 2017, 2 years later, just over 200,000 people reported having been beneficiaries of this mission. So basically, the banner of social policy is almost eliminated. So we're not talking about the kind of more marginal missions, we're talking about the core social missions. And the same thing has been happening in education, for example. We're talking about around 25% of the schooling population dropping out and lagging behind their normal age of instruction in education. So a quarter of the Venezuelan population in ages of education. But it's very different in terms of food programs. So the government has in fact focused its most important political muscle and policy muscle in actions in this area alone. So in 2015, 2.6 million people have reported having received benefits of Misión Alimentación. But 2 years later, 12.6 million people reported having received CLAP boxes. And what are these things? The CLAP are the Comités Locales de Abastecimiento y Producción, which are a distributed network of packaged foods, most of which are imported. And this network is centralized, very important, is centralized by military authorities and distributed in a discretionary manner to grassroots organizations and community councils without any formal oversight by any publicly elected official. They respond directly to the higher ranks of the military, who in turn respond to the presidency. So, even though this is the case, that 12.6 million people have been beneficiaries of these boxes, the CLAPs are not delivered regularly, and the process vary depending on the locations and depending on the authority of the local authorities. And the boxes, the content of the boxes is also inconsistent. So the surveyed individuals reported using the CLAP boxes not as their main source of dietary consumption, but as a tool for barter and commercial exchange later on. So you may receive a subsidized product now that you don't use, but you exchange it for another product that you may need, or for money in order to buy the things that you actually require. So how does the Venezuelan government distribute these boxes? So the main mechanism is through an ID called the Carnet de la Patria, which is translated roughly as the Homeland ID. This ID has a QR code, which is used to store information about each citizen, their socioeconomic conditions, the kinds of benefits that they receive or they should receive, and where they live, etc. This Homeland ID has been used to basically replace the traditional citizenship ID, the one that you have at the back of the Carnet de la Patria in this particular photo. So, for example, you hear reports of government officials requesting people to provide this ID in order to get very basic bureaucratic procedures, and official letters that you may require from your local authorities, etc. So people are coerced to get this Homeland ID. And according to the government, this ID gives you opportunities to obtain all sorts of benefits from homes, university scholarships, and humanized birth services. And here you have a few quotes from the state-run media and President Maduro himself, speaking about the kind of things that are provided through this ID. But in reality, beyond the propaganda, the efforts of the government really focuses on exclusively the distribution of these food boxes. And indeed, most people who receive the boxes report having a Carnet de la Patria holder in their households. So around 70% of the households who receive the CLAP report having a Carnet de la Patria holder in their homes. And only 18 who receive it don't have a Carnet de la Patria holder. But the main point of my talk is that the government has used this also to coerce the population into political participation in favor of the Venezuelan government, thus limiting their political rights as well. this has been done mostly since 2017, when the Venezuelan government organized non-competitive or scarcely competitive elections, where the principles of one vote, one person have been clearly violated, and where the electoral conditions and polling stations have been changed dramatically. One of the most significant changes has been the location of the so-called puntos rojos, which, by the way, have been there in the past, but these are much more active now. These red focal points, as I translated in a creative way, they are located right outside the polling stations. And what happens is that government activists are located there and demand that people, before going into the station, come into these places and activate their carnet de la patria before casting their votes. This procedure works together with different threats and suggestions that the government may be capable of actually knowing who you voted for. Ultimately, what this happens is that it spreads the risk for common Venezuelans that their access to subsidized food can be questioned. Which is, even though it's not, as I said, crucial to meet the dietary needs, is very important as a source of income replacement. So the use of electronic forms of data gathering has been very successful at assuring the participation in elections that are deemed as non-competitive and generally immersed in quite adverse economic and political conditions, most importantly hyperinflation and increasing poverty rates. So these red focal points have been equipped with computers and phone lines and vehicles which facilitate voters' mobilizations during election day. According to the work of Michael Penfold, this was particularly used and successful in October 2017 in urban centers and poor neighborhoods in particular, where even though opposition support had been growing systematically in the past few years, the government managed to reverse that. And the population is definitely far more subjected here to governmental pressures, and their dependence on government-subsidized foods is much higher. So in the context of economic crisis and hyperinflation, the government's popularity has been hit pretty bad, but the crisis has also been used in a very smart way by the government as an opportunity to use the poorest people's needs for political support and for social discipline. The point here is that the methods of surveillance and data gathering are used not only in electoral processes, this is just the tip of the iceberg, but these are also carried out together with threats to keep the population under control, away from protesting, this is just to add to the intimidation, and away from demanding policy changes. So people feel kind of guilty and they don't talk, and they are afraid that their bugs will be taken away. So basically discipline has been assured through this very clear electronic mechanism, whereas before it was kind of alternating with the lineups and the queuing and obviously the militarization of supermarket distributions. But by militarizing the distribution beforehand, this is solved even prior. So, contrary to the traditional government propaganda and the message that has been spread by government supporters abroad, the Bolivarian regime has reduced or even eliminated the social policies of social protection in Venezuela and centered their political muscle on a policy of militarized food distribution, a network that is geared toward, most importantly, social control and political coercion, thus limiting the political rights of the vast majority of Venezuelans and the Venezuelan poor, who are apparently kind of the banner of the government. So I'll leave it at that and I will continue to talk later. Thanks.